So, to this evening's event, I want to welcome you all to this first event in the fifth cycle of UCL French Embassy events. The first of these cycles took place in 2010-11 and revolved around the theme of research frontiers. The cycle as a whole is supported jointly by the French Embassy and UCL, and this particular event, this evening's event, is also supported by UKERC. So I would like to express my thanks, first of all, to Cyril von Effenterre from the French Embassy, and also to Jim Watson from UKERC for their kind and, if I may say so, magnanimous support for the event at rather short notice. When Ian Scott, in the corner at the front, of UCL Grand Challenges Office asked me early this year if UCL Energy Institute would like to take on the organisation of this cycle, I could only agree, it being the year of the Paris COP, and propose that the theme of the whole cycle be a series of reflections on the Paris COP. Our first event is a review of the issues that COP will have to deal with from the perspectives of the authors of a new UKERC book, and I don't suppose any of you has a copy that I could pick up and wave. Okay, and oversight on all of our parts. Global Energy, which has been co-authored by Paul Eakins, Jim Watson, and thank you, Mike Bradshaw. And we'll also have a reflection from Jean-Charles Aucard from CIRED, that is the Centre International de Recherche sur l'Environnement et Développement, one of the leading French authors in the field. Just as a heads up, the second event in this series will take place in March of next year and will reflect on the implications of COP21 for the developing world. And my colleagues, Jakob Mulligetta of STEEP and Gabriel Anandaraja of the Energy Institute have kindly offered to take on the task of organising the programme from the UCL side. And I look forward to working with them and also with Cyril on this in the coming weeks. The third event will take place in May, and I propose to leave the task of defining that event until after the dust has settled on the COP. We shall see. So, I will now invite Jean-Charles to kick us off with a reflection on the run-up to and the imperatives of the Paris COP. So.
Thank you very much. So that when I was invited here, I was thinking, well, what is useful to say tonight? So I decided to make a very personal presentation. For those who don't know me, I was a lot of time in the IPCC since '95, and I was part of the French delegation. I'm still part, but between Kyoto, before Kyoto and COP6, I was really one of the people really involved in the negotiations. So I have my personal vision of that. And then I will finish my talk about COP21, but I think this is impossible to understand COP21 if the young generation doesn't have something in mind about what was before. And this title is, well, in Latin, because this reminds me about the time in which I was better in Latin than in English. I was very good in English, but at that time I was very bad. So in the old times, very quickly, that's important to understand. This starts in 88. The climate affair is launched by the G7, the G7 with George Bush and Madame Thatcher. You cannot understand the launch of that without having in mind the ambiance in the world, with the energy security, with very low oil prices at that time, and with the perestroika, the start of the decline of the USSR. This was some kind of very strong geopolitical context in the world economy at that time. Then we launched that, and we come in Rio. In Rio de Janeiro, what is important that you have to understand what happens in this time. It is launched. The European countries said that's a good idea. Why it is a good idea? Because energy security, blah, blah, blah. And because we need a carbon price, and if we have a carbon tax, we'll succeed in cutting the labor taxes, will be good for the competitiveness, social security, and so on. That's the first white book, 91, with Delors and others. So that's the ambiance. So we go ahead. What is important that you understand is that the climate affair is not managed as a climate affair purely. Geopolitics, the way in which the macroeconomy, I would say, the people in charge of the global economy in the European Union says well, that's a good opportunity to make some progress. Rio de Janeiro, well, this fails. Well, I tried in 15 seconds because of the French. One very famous now colleague of mine, he was the same high school, Grande École, the Dominique Strauss-Kahn, well known or badly known for other reasons, who says, well, that's stupid to have a mixed tax on carbon and energy because the French wanted a single tax on carbon, not on energy, because the nuclear power is clean. And the joke was, well, is as stupid as taxing Coca-Cola to fight against alcoholism. Then the French stopped to support the carbon tax. In practice, there was a lot of industrial lobbies behind that, okay? But the turning point was there. We arrived with nothing in Rio, and then starts what I call a false idea. We come in Rio, the developed countries are there. We have nothing on the table, no tax, nothing. And they say, well, why are we here? And the response was sympathetic, but was, okay, don't worry. We, the North, will make commitments. Well, I'm sorry. This works? We'll make commitments, but you will make commitments later, okay? We will have a demonstration effect. And increasingly, I discovered that it was a really bad idea. Berlin, I will explain why. Because this is still on the table now, okay? So we go ahead, and you will join us later. Sympathetic. Berlin, we come at Berlin. We always in Europe talk about taxes. Nothing on caps and caps on trade. And then the Germans came they said, well, we can do minus 25% of decrease in the emissions in 2010. Why that? Two reasons. The real reason why is that they didn't want any tax on their industry. They were very happy to have the French killing the carbon tax in Europe because they didn't have on their shoulder the responsibility of that. They had a commitment not to have never a carbon price on their industry and to have only voluntary commitments. We come at Berlin. Berlin, they come on that. Well, hypnosis. Why hypnosis? Well, that's big economy. We said we can do that. Yes, they could do that because they are recuperated East Germany. Plus, well, start to exit from coal, energy efficiency, good bargain on that. But basically, this was there. And I can tell you that I discussed that with Jonathan Pershing, was the lead of the U.S. delegation at that time. U.S. delegation has a mandate not to accept any cap discussion, only taxes. They were first to phone to the Maison Blanche, the White House, in the night to change the mandate. And then we passed to Kyoto under hypnosis because nobody really wanted that. To discuss the cap and trade, because you have cap, you need trade. And because I have forced to go in a hurry, why then in Kyoto was the price to pay for false good idea? Can tell you, I negotiated with the US the compromise. We had a compromise. Nobody knows that now. 2 years before, I hope I will save time if this works. Yes. 2 days before, India, in the name of the G77, said we oppose to that. Cap and trade never work. We don't want any trade until the question of the entitlement of primary emission rights is resolved. Imagine that you have 2 days to discuss the per capita distribution in the world. What comes back here is what? I discussed with Sharma, and he said, well, that's the false good idea. Well, you decided to launch something. And then you say, we do nothing, but we are not stupid. We know that you are creating a system. We want to find the rules of the system. And you look at, he put a paper and said, well, you told us that, well, there was a cake to eat. You have eaten 2/3 of the cake, and you say that you will be very fair in sharing the rest of the cake. We don't believe that. But the rhetoric was in place. Fair burden sharing, so on and so forth. There are a lot of papers on that. We create a rhetoric which was totally incapable to link with the developing countries, to be understood by them. I add also to that the Bill Hagel resolution in the US, unanimous votation by the Senate. We don't want meaningful participation. We will never accept this type of system without a meaningful participation of developing countries. Why that? Simple. Because if I accept caps, I accept flows, automatic flows, and for geopolitical reasons, I don't want that. At that time, there was $10 billion to the Russians. Okay. So in Kyoto, it was clear that there is a mistake made in the cap approach in the countries and the burden sharing approach. The problem we have is that, so I come back here, I will pass to Den Hagen, this deal, because you can write my papers on that. We are nearly to succeed to have something, okay, but I keep that. The problem is that we had that in mind. And we came back now we arrive at 2009. We should have said, well, we understand better why we made mistakes, what was wrong in the approach. But we didn't do that. We didn't change the mental map of the negotiation. When the negotiator came at Copenhagen, they had exactly the same mental map. The cause of that, my personal interpretation, that we were just a bit hypocritical in the mental map. Okay, it was easy to discuss about that. But we had a very easy explanation. We had the bad Bush, and then comes the good Obama. Simple. You don't have to make a lot of discussions, okay? But the problem, the good Obama, he had a problem with the good Obama. Because of the death of Edward Kennedy, the share of the representation between the Democrats and the Republicans passed from 60 to 40 to 59 and 41. 60 to 40, he didn't have to ask the permission to the Republicans. But with the new forced relationships, he could do nothing. His priority was health system, and he was right. I would have been in his place, that's fine. And then we create some kind of big expectations that we lose something in Copenhagen. We should have done that. No, Obama could do nothing. And what I say missed step because we didn't use the really Copenhagen to revise the mental map. We did something. We created the so-called Great Climate Fund as a response to the demand of the developing countries. Not bad, but always the same story. We put money and we share the money. The same mistake, because then you have who pays in function of what? The CBDR. pays for what? Mitigation or adaptation. And for what country? You can make the list of the controversies about what to do with the Green Climate Fund. And we do that in a curious situation, a situation which was very adverse because we had the financial crisis in 2008. And then we say we will give a lot of money, but the public budgets are in deficit, and then in practice. We will not do that. Cancun's, I call that a silent paradigm shift. I will develop that, so that's fine. So that's the story. My interpretation is that we had a mental map, adopted partly in other agnosis, and we have lost a lot of time with the same mental map. And we have ready to review it very quickly. 1 minute to say, to give the ambience. That's purely ideological, but that's important. Raul Estrada, when he invented the CDM, to go out of the crisis created by the Indians, he put he wrote that 3 months later. Look at the end of these sections. This disparity has been at the root of every colonization since the time of the Greeks, which is a very strong sentence, which is the post-colonial countries against us. Okay, this was not the reality, but this gives something which is in the mind of the people who are still there around the table. Okay, so now I come back to Cancun. Cancun, we say, well, we get rid of the burden sharing paradigm. We want the concept of we have nationally appropriate mitigation action, and in practice we want what is not here. That's my fault. Equitable access to development, which is the key sentence. Okay. The problem is that then how to do that? I have 5 minutes still, or 10 minutes? 10? Fine? Huh? 7. Perfect. Then I stop in practice what I will comment on that. Okay. Then this was the title, I made the subtitle, we talk about global energy, global climate, but global economy also. We are in a very precise moment of the world economy. We want to launch, to trigger energy transition. We know that energy transition is not only energy. This concerns transportation, households. Sectors represent a large part of the gross capital formation. We know what? We know that we'll have to pay more in terms of investment over the short term, but not over the long term. The incremental investment is 0.5% to GDP, which is something substantial, but not which is affordable. The point is more that we have to redirect a lot of investment. So technically, you can make a good story with that. That's optimistic vision. The bad side of that, but we are in a context of depression economics. We talk about public debts, saving gluts. We have Larry Sommer, who talks about the so-called possibility of a secular stagnation. So we have to solve the problem. So the problem now is to say that if we want to be credible, to change the mental map, we have to accept that climate policies and energy transition has to be launched, despite or because of this bad situation. Because the people now they will be they will look at TV, newspapers, talking about climate and so on. Well, but what about my unemployment? The refugees, what happens in the Middle East? There are so many other urgencies. If we don't develop a discourse making the link between the short-term and the long-term tensions, then we'll have a problem of credibility. I think that we have a chance if we change the mental map, if we go quickly in that direction. Because what was the mistake? Implicitly, we have prices, cap and trade-off taxes, you have compensating transfers between north and south. The problem is that carbon prices, if they are significant, hurt the capital stock in developing countries very, very heavily, in our countries also. But $50 per ton of carbon doubles the cost of cement in India. You will not ask the British and the French to compensate the Indians for that. And even $50 per ton will never control the dynamics of the urban, will not control the urban dynamics in India, in Brazil, and so on, because this is related to other prices, real estate speculation, land use changes, other determinants. So we really have to account for that and to say, but how to align all these policies. We need a carbon price, we need prices, but they will not do the job alone. Second story, and we'll sit on that, I think we economists, we have badly educated people about the role of prices. Because in practice, we have this type of things. We rank cost, we say you have cost, and then you have prices, and you will equate the cost in every country, and we'll gain in efficiency. But I'm sorry, this is true. The cost of a technology is not like the cost of the price of an apple or an orange on in the merchant. That's more complex. The cost is there. You have a lot of technologies. Some, I'll pick here A and B. Assume that A is better than B. You make a levelized cost is better. Okay. And B is worst. Assume that B is carbon intensive. Then you have a tax. Okay, fine. I will conclude on that. You have a tax, and then B becomes worst. But nevertheless, B will not be adopted. Why that? Because A is so capital intensive that if you make a mistake, then you have to go to see your banker, and your shareholder will say, oh, guy, no, I don't like what you have made. I take so many risks that I don't want to go there. So we have a problem in the nature of the modern capitalism, which hates the long-term investments. And I will conclude on that then. I think we are talking, if you look at what is written by the microeconomists, they talk about the saving glut, the gap between propensity to save and propensity to invest. The chance we have, if we can explain that, we have, because we talk about serious sectors with large amount of the gross capital formation, if we say we know how to accelerate these investments, if there is something which has to see with the way in which we can guarantee the investment over the long run, and I will not develop that if we have 1 minute, perhaps. Say the idea, and then so I will jump to the. Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake with that. The question, though, is that we need taxes, but we need to guarantee the investments, and to do that, we need what was made during the railway revolution in the past: public guarantee and assets. The assets in the past was the land. When you had the line, you had the land. And then the animal spirits of finance looked like that, because when you had the line, even though it didn't work, you had the land. What is the equivalent now? We have to create carbon assets in the way that if we agree on economic and social value of carbon, then we can, and if we imagine that the governments can make some commitments of some quantity of guarantees they put, then you can create a system in which you can create carbon assets and then harness the animal spirits of finance to redirect the large amount of savings out of the speculation to the low carbon transition, and design mechanisms in which you cut down the investment risks in low carbon technologies. You have to go both sides to cut the risk on investment technologies, and to use for that part of the savings you redirect. Then I conclude, and that's it. We have signed a lot of us a declaration that with which is now floating around in the corridors of the negotiation in Bonn, and a lot of countries, including Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, they understand that. I don't say that we succeed now, but I think the challenge would be to develop better our thoughts about how to do economic, finance, and technical change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can have our next speaker, Jim, if you can join us. Jim, for those of you who don't know him, is the Director of UKERC, the UK Energy Research Centre.
Thank you very much, and particularly to Jean-Charles for that fascinating story of where we've come to be just before Paris, but also what some of the things we might expect, and perhaps some reflections after we've all spoken about the book as well would be great. I'm not going to spend very long on this, so we can get on with the business of telling you about the book that we're talking about today. So I just wanted to say a few words about UKERC, the UK Energy Research Centre, before we start, for those of you who don't know who we are. We're a national research centre. We're distributed. We bring together natural scientists, social scientists and engineers from around the UK working on energy systems. We don't develop the technologies, but we analyse those systems from those several perspectives. We're funded by the UK research councils, so we're independent, and all our researchers just about are based in UK universities, including at UCL. We pride ourselves, as it says here on the slide, of being independent and excellent. We do our academic papers and our books, but we try as far as possible to do work which is relevant to policymakers, to industry and to other audiences. So engagement is as much of our work as of the research itself. So this event, I think, is a very good example of the kind of thing we do, and hopefully will have some impact both in terms of discussions here today, but also in the cacophony, the accelerating cacophony in the run-up to Paris and the Conference of the Parties. The only other thing I'd like to say, just by way of introduction before handing over to Paul to introduce the book, is just to acknowledge my predecessor, Jim Skee, as a research director of UKERC, who kicked off the project that led to the book that we have now published and we're going to talk about today. You'll hear from Jim in a few minutes. So thanks, that's all from me for now, and I'll talk a bit more later about the book itself.
So it's an enormous pleasure to be here. I'm Paul Eakins from UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. I've been involved with the UK Energy Research Centre ever since it was set up in 2004. And this book, which we're going to launch today, is a very special output in the sense that it was dreamt up towards the end of phase 2 of UKERC, when Jim Skee was still the research director, and it's now been published well into phase 3 of UKERC with Jim Watson as research director. Jim Skee has written chapter 1, and he's going to talk a bit about that. Jim Watson has written chapter 2, and he's going to talk a bit about that. There are then 22 odd chapters in between, which cover practically every energy-related subject under the sun. And then we come towards the end, the scenarios and policy aspects, scenarios aspects done by colleagues at UCL Energy Institute, with Gabriel very much involved, Steve Pye, Christophe McGlade, and I as a very kind of junior author at the end of that long list of modelling luminaries. And then the policy chapter, which is what I really do, chapter 26, which I'm going to talk about a bit at the end. I've rather foolishly left my copies of the book up there. They're actually very heavy, so they serve well as a doorstop, as well as a source of great intellectual illumination. You'll find the leaflets outside, and they will give you a 30% discount on the book, which the hard copy at least is not cheap. The paperback copy, which is published at the same time, is a little cheaper. The way I describe it is that it's a smaller version of the Global Energy Assessment. I don't know how many of you were involved in the Global Energy Assessment, or indeed have seen a copy of that. That is not a doorstop, it's a tower block. And this is about a half the size, I guess. It covers more or less the same territory, really does lots on energy supply, rather less than it should probably on energy demand, but covers that territory reasonably well, has extra chapters on the material implications and the ecosystem implications of different sorts of energy systems, and then, as I say, moves into some of the political economy issues and some of the public policy issues. And that, I think, is all I need to say by way of introduction. We're going to pop up and do our 3 parts of the book now from 3 of the people who've been most involved in it. Perhaps I could just pay tribute to Mike Bradshaw, at Warwick Business School, very much involved in UKERC, can't be with us tonight. He wrote many of the chapters around the fossil fuels. He's an expert on the political economy of gas, the economic geography of fossil fuels, and so that's been his contribution, and it's been great. But perhaps we'll get on with the show now. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jim Ski, who I think of all of us needs no introduction at all. Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. I haven't rehearsed this at all. Right, yeah, I do have my presentation here. Well, the job I was given by the editors of the book, and I'm not sure whether this was because I was the retiring UKERC director and they felt sorry for me, but my job was to write the first chapter that touched on almost everything that was in the rest of the book without duplicating or overlapping with what came in the subsequent chapters. So what I'm going to do is do an incredibly fast spin through some of the factoids, as it were, that are presented in that chapter 1. And what I would say about this is, first of all, I mean, Jean-Charles mentioned climate change as the major issue, but one of the things that comes across very clearly, even if you set aside climate change, the tectonic plates in the global energy system would be changing anyway. And it was that kind of convergence of these factors that we were trying to set the scene for in this particular piece of work. And also trying to demonstrate that we couldn't think about this in the UK or Europe alone. We needed to really, really think in a global context if we were going to understand what was going on. So very quickly through it. This is historical global energy use back just over 40 years. Very clear picture. It's dominated by fossil fuels, the blue, the red and the green. The annual growth has been about 2% per year, but it accelerated when we got into the last decade. And in fact, you'll see that the acceleration in the growth was largely caused by the growing use of coal over the last decade. Now, what IPCC did was to try to explain what was going on with the change in greenhouse gas emissions associated with this, breaking it down into 4 factors: population growth, income growth, energy intensity of GDP, and the carbon intensity of energy. So you can see energy intensity of GDP is constantly below the line, tending to pull emissions down, as until about 10 years ago was the carbon intensity of energy. But what you see was that population and income were driving emissions up in a very obvious way. But there was a big change when we got to the last decade, because income growth accelerated, largely to do with growth in Asia, and that pushed us up. And at the same time, carbon intensity actually went backwards, largely because of that increase of coal use in China. So this was the kind of thing that we're facing when we are walking up a down escalator, rather, when we're trying to deal with climate change at the moment. But there are promising signs. This is going back about 15 years. This is the growth of output of wind and solar energy. It's still a very small part of the overall energy picture, but the growth is truly extraordinary, I think, over the last 15 years. And most of it here is dominated by wind energy in developed countries, but wind in developing countries is also becoming extremely important. And in fact, the largest installation of wind is in China now at the moment. Solar energy, right at the top, also growing, but lower load factors mean that it has made less of a difference in terms of actual energy output. Now, one of the things we looked at in there was to compare everybody's outlooks for energy, and we chose the year 2040 to compare them, because that simple pragmatic reason, that was the one year we could get everybody on the same, singing from the same hymn sheet and get a year in which we would compare. So at the left we've got the 2011 baseline, and we have a range of projections here for 2040 from public bodies like the International Energy Agency, private companies like Exxon, Shell and BP. And there are some things about this picture that are common between people. Everybody thinks that energy use is going to go up. Everybody thinks that energy efficiency is going to improve. Everybody thinks there's going to be more gas. and everybody thinks there's going to be more renewable energy. These are the common themes that you got to cut across it. Where you see big differences are the degree to which coal will continue to be used, and also importantly the use of energy for transportation. That's something that really distinguishes the different scenarios. So, and the other big differentiator, it's in the title, is the assumption about what happens to dealing with climate change. Because some of these scenarios are kind of extrapolations of what is happening at the moment. Many of those to the right-hand side are of that nature. But the IEA 2 degrees scenario on the left-hand side is a normative scenario where it says what the answer is, we must get to 2 degrees, then works backwards to say what needs to happen to the energy system. And this is just to emphasize the point on renewable energy. It's 2011 is the amount of renewable energy in use globally, and everybody thinks that renewable energy is going to expand, even in a business as usual scenario. And in fact, if you look to the right-hand side, this is the Shell Ocean scenario right at the right-hand side, shows an enormous growth in solar energy, for example. Now, the other point we wanted to emphasize, it's not all about climate, you know, the energy dynamics matter as well. And we've actually done a little bit of historical work on what has happened to trade in energy. And this graph refers to oil. We've got them for gas and coal as well. And you see, back in the 1970s, when we had the oil crisis, many developed countries were very dependent on imports of oil. There was a big response to that in terms of economics and policy. That import dependency fell. But when prices fell in the 1980s, we gradually began to get addicted to oil again. And now the dependency is up to where it was before, with the one change that China is now a major importer of oil as well. So very different dynamics in the global energy system. The other point I would want to emphasize, and it's something that our US colleagues felt was perhaps missing from the last IPCC report, was the extent of the shale gas revolution in the United States and what it's actually done to global energy markets. These are the projections from the US Department of Energy, showing just what they expect to happen to the shale gas contribution to US gas demand out to 2040. And whereas shale gas was next to nothing a decade ago, they can see it meeting half of US gas demand by the time we're out sort of 2 to 3 decades from now. So a very big change in the overall picture. And the other thing that we've seen there, and Mike Bradshaw, the third editor, this is really his speciality area, global gas markets. Between about the mid-1980s and maybe about 10 years ago, prices of natural gas were really quite convergent in the Far East, in Europe, in the United States. But with the shale gas revolution, and also with the Fukushima accident, we started to see these divergences in regional gas markets. So by the end of the picture, you've seen US gas prices plummeting, Europe continuing to go up, but a real development of gas prices in Japan, a very wide separation, which cannot exist forever. There have to be some changes in trading patterns to begin to equilibrate with these very different gas prices. And I've got one last diagram, which is a bit complicated, but let me just say that what it illustrates is the interconnectedness of global energy demand and says why we need to think globally. What it is looking at changes in power station fueling between 2010 and 2012 in 3 major markets. Below the line, that means you reduced that type of electricity generation. Above the line, it means you increased it. And basically, it combines 3 things: the shale gas revolution, persistent investment in new renewable energy, and the Fukushima accident. So if we take the US at the right, we had the shale gas revolution pushing more gas into US power markets. There was also continuing investment in renewable energy. It drove coal out of US power station markets, which then moved across to Europe, where it combined with renewable energy to push natural gas out of the European markets. And finally, the natural gas was then picked up again in Japan, where it helped to compensate partly for the loss of power due to the Fukushima nuclear accident. And I think this is a beautiful illustration of why you can't think about one region of the world separately. This is real interconnectedness, and that's the kind of thing that I hope this book is tried to demonstrate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. And,
Thank you, Bob. Don't worry, we're not going to keep swapping gyms all evening. It will reach its limit eventually. So I'm going to talk largely about chapter 2 of the book, which was concerned with giving an overview of things to consider when analysing innovation in energy systems, which has become an increasingly global business conducted by multinational firms, and some of the considerations for national policy that flow from that, which again tend you towards the role of collaboration as well as towards lessons for national policy in individual countries. As Jean-Charles was saying as well, this is one of the ways in which energy systems start to get linked to broader discussions about the global economy as a whole, because innovation does have the power to actually be the driver of new industries and changes in economic structure. So this is one of the ways in which the energy system links to broader economic trends. The book itself, as Paul was saying, has a number of other chapters that look in detail on innovation in areas like solar, wind, demand-side technologies, and networks. So this is very much an overview. Nice to see many of the authors of the other chapters in the audience, so that's where you'll find the detail on that. So in my 10 minutes, I just wanted to make a couple of conceptual points about how to understand innovation, talk a little bit about how we actually measure innovation, if governments and companies are trying to understand what's happening, where it's going, is it going fast enough, and then I'll end with some pointers for policy and some lessons for policy. So a couple of things on how we might understand innovation. So we're very used in, certainly in my world, my corner of academia, talking about energy innovation systems. So instead of talking about just single technologies, thinking about how they fit into systems of energy, but also systems of innovation. At the top of this slide, which is taken from the Global Energy Assessment that Paul mentioned earlier, is a kind of traditional linear model of innovation, which certainly was around for a lot of the 20th century. The idea basically that you do research, usually in laboratories by people in white coats, and then that things pop out which then get further developed, they get demonstrated, perhaps scaled up, and then they get diffused in markets. It's very much a linear model, as it says there, from the laboratory through to the market. But as people have studied this in a great detail, and actually industry practice as well, it's become clear that actually that's not how innovation happens at all. And the bottom diagram, although it's a very much a simplification of the real world, is closer to the way in which innovation happens. So yes, we do have these distinct stages, and these are true of many energy technologies. Some are at the research stage, some are at the demonstration stage, and some are diffusing, like solar PV, for example. But there are very big feedbacks between those stages. A lot of innovation happens at market deployment stage, as well as in the laboratory. So the cost falls we've seen in solar technology isn't largely due to people in laboratories inventing new solar technologies. It's to do with innovation in processes of manufacturing those solar cells and getting the cost of that manufacture down through mass production and scaling up in places like China. The bottom diagram also emphasises that actors are important and networks and institutions. That's really code for saying, well, yes, companies matter, so do public sector research institutions and private ones, but also governments, crucially, can set policy frameworks which can influence the direction of these innovation processes. So I think that's really important too. I think a final point, which the diagram doesn't really illustrate as well, is that all innovation is not technological. What we study in the book and talk about, particularly on the demand side, is the role of social innovation too, the way in which you arrange things differently, the way in which people's behaviour may have to change, or we may need new business models in order to get new types of innovation to work. My second diagram, again I'm not going to go through it in detail, is one of the famous or notorious, depending on your taste, McKinsey curves, which line up all of the abatement opportunities. This is a global curve, and say what their costs are going to be. So on the left-hand side, you have all the so-called negative cost options, which should be implemented anyway, at least if you're a dry theoretical economist. And on the right-hand side are options which will actually cost a lot of money in order to abate CO2, tons of CO2. I'm not going to go through all of these, of course, but I'm using the diagram to illustrate three basic points which were in the boxes on the diagram. First is that this sort of diagram is used to advance the case that there are many negative cost measures that should simply be invested in, particularly on the demand side of the energy system. So energy efficiency technologies, which will save people money and businesses money, often in a very short space of time. But often the problem is that they need upfront investment, and there are a whole range of well-documented barriers to investment, both in the individual level, the community level, and the industry level, which stop them being taken up. So there's a case for policy intervention to accelerate the uptake of those measures, to overcome the cost and financing barriers, but also some of the points that Jean-Charles was talking about with respect to risk of new technologies compared to incumbent technologies. The second point at the bottom there, often we need new infrastructures, that's network infrastructures, in order to realise the potential of newer low-carbon technologies. So if we're, for example, shifting from gas-based heating systems, like we have in the UK largely for most households, to electric-based heating systems, or to hydrogen, or to biomass-fueled heating systems in some areas, each of those has implications not only just for the end-use technology and the user of those heating systems, but actually for the network infrastructure that we need to deliver the energy to deliver the heat to those homeowners. And that requires investment. And there's often lock-in to existing infrastructures, partly because those costs are sunk. They've been paid for over decades quite often, so it's easier to reuse them. But also that the laws, regulations, and the companies are set up to make the best of those network infrastructures. That we have economies of scale, so it's easier economically to use them. So when you try and change those infrastructures, it can be incredibly difficult. So infrastructures are important too, not just individual technologies. Thirdly, not all of these technologies are at the same stage. They're often talked about interchangeably, whereas on this slide are technologies which are fully commercial. You can go and buy them, and they're actually fairly cost-effective now. LED lighting, increasingly, for example. But there are technologies which are still at the demonstration phase. I'll just pick out CCS, carbon capture and storage, on the right-hand side there. That's still being demonstrated at scale in North America and a number of other countries, including, potentially in the future, the UK. So those sorts of technologies, investors still face a lot of risk and a lot of cost. It still needs to cross what's called the valley of death in the innovation literature in order to reach commercial deployment. So you need different types of policies for those than you do for the commercial technologies. So secondly, how do you actually measure what's going on? First, the temptation is to look at research and development spending, the input of the energy system, the front end, if you like. This shows some more IEA data to build on what Jim Ski showed. This is R&D spending of all the IEA member countries that reported R&D spending over time since its foundation in 1974. 2014 data is incomplete, so don't go away with the impression that R&D spending has suddenly taken a nosedive in 2014. It's not actually complete data. You can see there have been peaks and troughs in that, largely following the trends in the oil price, which is the black line on the same scale. So when oil prices are high, we've tended to have a lot of R&D spending. When they've fallen, R&D spending has fallen. But also, in the most recent years, the financial crisis led to a lot of stimulus spending, and that accounts for the very sharp peak in 2008, 2009, and of course the advent of climate change and concern about that has driven R&D spending trends. One final point to make on this before I move on is notice the difference in balance of spending between the left-hand side, where the orange really dominates, that's nuclear power spending, R&D, and on the right-hand side where we've ended up, where there's a much better, you might say, or at least a more balanced portfolio between demand, nuclear power, renewables, system technologies, and so on. So there's been a real rebalancing of spending in many countries over that period of time. A final point, because I haven't got a slide on it, is and something that Jim Ski's work has revealed, is that if you look at private sector spending, not public sector spending, you get a very different pattern, at least according to the data we can get hold of, which is private sector spending on R&D is still dominated by fossil fuel R&D. So the innovations that gave us things like the shale revolution are still dominating private sector spending. It's not renewable energy. So you have these rather different worlds, depending on which industry you look at, between public sector and private sector. Another way of looking at it, just before I move on to that, I wanted to find some data on China, because China is missed off the IEA data. It's very hard to get hold of reliable data for China. This is quite old because it only ends in 2008. You can see even around 10 years ago, Chinese R&D, as reported, had started to overtake R&D spending by the biggest spender in OECD, which is the US. So China is increasingly putting a lot of money into development of technologies. Another way of looking at innovation and measuring it is outputs, what comes out of the innovation process. A lot of the economists spend a lot of time looking at patent data. And on one hand, this trend of patent data from OECD, patent database shows what you'd expect, which is as climate change has become more high profile, there has been an increase, a very sharp increase in patenting activity on many low carbon technologies, renewables, and carbon capture and storage is much lower in the orange there, and a number of other technologies which are associated with low carbon infrastructures like hydrogen. But I think there is, again, some health warnings here for this data. Many technology developers do not patent what they find, so there's a lot of innovation goes on which isn't patented, so it won't show up in this data. And if you look at the detailed research evidence on that, there's lots of examples of it. And the second is looking at raw patenting numbers, you could get a skewed idea. So, for example, in China, Chinese patenting has accelerated very rapidly in the last few years, partly because of incentives for researchers to patent. But it doesn't necessarily mean those companies and those researchers are actually catching up and are now at the forefront of research in particular technologies. That really varies quite sharply across technology groups. So patents are useful, but again, you need to be clear that they're only a partial answer to the question of what's going on. Final measure, which we talk about in the book, is outcomes, investment. Where is investment going? This really mirrors one of the graphs that Jim showed again from IEA, looking at investment in the power sector globally on some of the renewables. Clearly you can see acceleration. Some of that, of course, is mature technologies, but some of that is very much due to the interplay of public policy, innovation, and deployment. And certainly, until you look at it recently, it's getting up to about 50% of total additions of capacity in those countries that are shown there. So that's just some more data that you can use to look at what's going on. So finally, what does all this mean for public policy? Well, clearly what we find in many of the individual cases and across the board is that government policy has a very significant impact on the level and direction of innovation. Government policy, obviously, in a climate change mitigation direction, but also government policies, for example, in the US, that is encouraging things like the shale revolution, whether it's R&D or the particular set of policy institutional arrangements that were in place that allowed that shale gas revolution to take off. So not all government policy is pointing in the low carbon direction, but it has a very big influence nevertheless. I think an important thing for the negotiators, when I was advising UK and EU negotiators, a point that we always made very strongly, is that technologies aren't owned by the negotiators. Often they talk as if they are. Actually, the energy technologies are owned by firms and by research institutes, so they've got to put together packages of finance and technological incentives that persuade those companies to collaborate and deploy those technologies in the way that's desired. But they don't own those technologies and they can't trade those technologies directly. Thirdly, I think there's a lot of evidence out there that government spending should be increased on R&D. Compared to many other sectors, the energy sector does not spend very much money on R&D if you compare it to pharmaceuticals, ICTs. Partly those industries are structured very differently, but R&D intensity is very low. But I've put the Apollo program front cover on there, really to make the point that we don't need to pour loads and loads more money into fundamental R&D if we want to meet our climate targets. Of course, as a researcher, I'd welcome that, but I think it's really important to not lose sight of the incentives for demonstration and deployment of the technologies we already know about. And if we lose that, then we're certainly not going to meet the challenges that we have. And then finally, if governments are going to get into the business of increasing spending and directing that spending, then it's important to have sufficient capacity to understand how do you make choices about which innovations to support, because not all countries can support all technologies, but also how do you learn from successes and failures? How do you give industry enough space to succeed and fail and experiment? But how do you learn from that and adjust your priorities accordingly? So I'll leave it there.
So, as I said, we now fast forward through 20 more odd chapters, and sorry to those authors who are here that we couldn't have everybody here. We should have had a whole day on this, really, but there we go. To chapters 24 and 26. I can't believe at this stage of the evening that no one has yet mentioned the energy trilemma, that nice little concept that signifies that there are these kind of three big objectives now that dominate energy policy in practically all countries of the world: decarbonisation and energy security and energy affordability, and obviously for businesses as well as households. And only the first one of those is really new, and the extent to which the others are met and how they are met will depend to a very large extent on how countries go about meeting their decarbonisation objectives. So I have no real apologies for focusing on that tonight, especially as this is a global energy, global climate evening. Something which is very striking to me as I look at the policy side of this is that actually the energy choices facing countries are political choices. There are all sorts of siren calls from industries saying you need our particular technology and you need to spend shed loads of money on it, and we would expect that, of course. But if one looks, different countries are making very different choices in pursuing those elements of the trilemma which are important to them at a particular time. The options will play out enormously differently in terms of energy security and cost. The economic and political cost of making the wrong decisions is very great indeed. There will need in innovation policy to be some balance between developing portfolios and encouraging diversity and then picking winners quite unashamedly when it seems that it is clear which technologies can be driven to scale in order to drive down costs. The demand side will need to be dealt with very importantly. Most earlier assessments of energy futures have erred very greatly on exaggerating the supply that would be necessary. And of course there is a need for immediate decarbonisation and the avoidance of future carbon lock-in. Chapter 26 looks at those 5 bullet points in a bit of detail. Some of them have been dealt with in much more detail in earlier chapters, but the 2 I'm going to focus on in the next 2 slides have not. One is energy access, which is going to be an absolutely critical determinant of whether we meet our carbon targets or not. About 1.4 billion people in the world today don't have access to any kind of electricity, and they want that access, and increasingly they can get that access. The question is, what does that access mean in terms of the amount of electricity to which they will aspire? If you are the IEA, then it seems that it's this amount down here. This little button, no good, no, I will go back. The top one, is it? Gives us a, no. All right, that's fine, I will cope without it. So energy access, you can see the IEA at the bottom. That's their definition of energy access, where this is actual and projected global per capita electricity consumption. And you can see that it's very considerably below the Bulgarian per capita electricity consumption of 2010, which is the 3rd of the bars down there. How that works out in terms of the amount of electricity that the currently unserved populations of the world want and how they choose to provide that electricity is going to have an enormous impact on global carbon emissions. The second elephant in the room, so to speak, which is dealt with a bit in this chapter, is the issue of urbanisation. An extraordinary factoid is that the majority of the urban infrastructure that will exist in 2050 still has to be built. We are going through a phenomenon of urbanisation that is unprecedented in the history of humanity. And whether the cities end up looking like Atlanta, which is the one on the left, or Barcelona, which is the one on the right, will have an enormous implication for global carbon emissions. Atlanta, the 2 cities are broadly the same population, they're broadly the same GDP. You can see that the urban footprint of Atlanta is many times that of Barcelona, and the carbon emissions per person in public and private transport are 7 tons CO2 per year, and in Barcelona they're 1/10 of that. So those kinds of differences are enormously important and will make a huge difference. Moving on then to the chapter 24, global energy scenarios, modelling the future. I see huge yawns coming from my UCL Energy Institute colleagues here because they know all this stuff much better than I do. Lots of uncertainty, which these models are intended to capture. The importance of being able to vary these assumptions and subject them to sensitivity analysis. This is the TAM-UCL model. I make no apologies for putting it up here because it is the result of over 10 years consistent investment by the research councils in the energy system modelling capacity in the UK. Neil Strachan is the particular genius who's been with this process ever since it started, and now obviously at the UCL Energy Institute, and I think he's here somewhere in the audience, and has built round him a very expert modelling team that has carried out work using this model. I love this stuff, partly because I only try to understand it and I don't actually have to do it. It produces these marvellous little diagrams, such as the one on the right, which shows you the minimum rate of decarbonisation that will be necessary to meet the 2-degree target, depending on the peaking year of global emissions. And you can see that in order to reach a 2-degree target, we've got to start pretty well. We've got to diminish at 3% a year, more or less immediately, and then the longer we leave the peaking, the more difficult it's going to be to meet those targets. I'm going to skip those because otherwise I should be shut up, and move just to one slide that has the 4 elements of what have emerged from those scenarios from our model which meet the 2-degree target. So if we look at the top left, you see that the 2DS scenario and the 2DS without bioenergy CCS, they are characterized by much more electricity than the other scenarios, the reference or the 3DS. And though that is a characteristic that emerges, electricity takes on a major role in the decarbonisation of both transport and heat, as well as serving classical functions of electricity use. If we look at the top right, we can see the greenhouse gas intensity of that electricity falling like a stone from about 500 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour in 2010 down to negative levels in 2035, a mere 25 years to effectively decarbonise the electricity system. Down at the bottom left here we have our model's version of contraction and convergence. Those are per capita greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis, and you can see the high income, the middle income and the low income countries, the way that that develops. By 2050, the per capita incomes have not quite converged at the same level, but they are definitely moving in that direction. And finally, we don't impose carbon taxes. The model imposes its own kind of shadow carbon price to achieve this decarbonisation. And there you see the sorts of carbon prices that will be necessary if one were to use just carbon prices in order to decarbonise, rising to something like $600 a tonne by 2050. That seems a lot, until you realise that a country like the UK, with its gasoline and diesel taxes, already has an implicit carbon price, if that tax were a carbon price, of about half that. So you can see that moving towards a $600 per tonne carbon price by 2050 may not be quite as extraordinary and impossible as it sounds. Just a few wrap-up slides. The key elements of a low-carbon future are to do with costs of investments, financial requirements, and that Charles gave us a lot of detail and interesting comment on earlier. Innovation, technological research, development, deployment, institutions, policies, and social practices. That was something that Jim Watson talked a lot about. There is other work going on in the research councils as well, obviously, as in UK Energy Research Centre, on transitions. How do we actually get from here to there in detail? What needs to be put in place when, in order to ensure that we're ready to put the next building blocks in place and don't lock ourselves into a place that we don't want to go, and obviously issues of policies. It's an unprecedented policy challenge, but one that is eminently feasible. It depends to a large extent on carbon pricing, in my view, but carbon pricing absolutely buttressed and supported by technology policy to get the kind of innovation and investment that Jim and Jean-Charles were talking about, and the removal of barriers to the promotion of behaviour change. That was Nick Stern's menu of policy options back in 2007, and it's still pretty solid. So, conclusions. Effective climate policy. The kind of climate policy that will put us close to the track of 2 degrees will depend on, obviously, political will, and we're beginning to see that coming through with these intended nationally determined contributions coming through for the Paris COP in a few weeks' time. A recognition that the co-benefits of climate mitigation are as great, if not greater, than the actual carbon benefits. And this is particularly important for developing countries, which are much more focused on the present than the future. By co-benefits, I mean particularly air pollution. Many of you will have seen the estimates from the IMF recently that the costs of the fossil fuel economy, most of them external costs, in this year are estimated to be something like $5.3 trillion, which is a large sum, and a lot of those costs can be avoided by climate policy. UCL has played its part in trying to emphasize that through the production earlier this year of the UCL Lancet Commission report on global health and climate change, and we were very gratified by the amount of coverage that that receives. Further cost reductions in low-carbon technologies. The cost reductions that we've seen, I missed out the slides of that, they are in the book, obviously, have been simply extraordinary. And there's plenty more cost reduction in the major renewables technologies to come. There were similar cost reductions in nuclear, but they still seemingly are being held back by all sorts of other factors. But the renewables are really going it in terms of cost reduction, such that in many parts of the world they are now more or less cost competitive, given the need to build them into a functioning grid with other systems. And of course the desire in importing countries to limit exposure to fossil fuel exporters. My favourite example of that is Egypt, a fossil fuel importer sandwiched between Middle East fossil fuel exporters. Egypt now has a very ambitious programme of feed-in tariffs for solar energy, precisely in order to get itself off fossil fuels. It also has a lot of sun, and the feed-in tariffs it's having to pay are very small because the cost differential is much, much lower than it was. So my last thought, the limiting factor in ultimate fossil fuel consumption emissions will be on the demand rather than the supply side. Many of you will have heard the old saw. I was giving another talk at another place today where they hadn't heard this. They thought it was rather funny. So I'll say it again, but if you know it, well, you probably won't find it so funny a second time round. But the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. It ended because there were better things to use for what stones had been used for. And the fossil fuel age won't end because we run out of fossil fuels. The Earth's crust is absolutely swimming in the stuff. It will end because we find better ways, cleaner ways, smarter ways to meet the energy demands that we have. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, in fact our discussant, is Jill Duggan of Doosan Babcock, who will attempt to bring some kind of order to the 6 wide-ranging talks that we've heard this evening so far. So, Jill, if you'd like to make yourself at home at the podium. Thank you.
I'm hoping that my microphone is working. I think I probably ought to tell you a little bit more about who I am. I'm an advisor to Doosan Babcock, and they are a company that supply and engineering solutions to the energy industry. But I'm not just an advisor to Doosan Babcock. I also am a former policy maker from DEC and DEFRA. I used to have the distinction of being head of international emissions trading for a while. And I worked at the European Commission, also on climate policy, and advised California. So what that means is that today I sit on the board of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, the European Power Plant Suppliers Association, that mostly used to be German boilermakers, but also on the board of SAMBAG, which many of you may know is a campaigning think tank organisation. And as I said, I advise Doosan Babcock. And so actually, firstly, I thought everything today was extremely interesting, and as a former policymaker, I have enormous sympathy for policymakers and trying to get it right as you develop new policies, and the need for academic thinking to help inform that is absolutely paramount, and certainly of great benefit to policymakers. But as business, we need something a little bit different. And I've been going through a very interesting process with Doosan Babcock in the last 6 months, where they have started looking forward. As I said, Doosan Babcock have been an energy, an engineering and technology provider to the energy industry. In fact, Babcock used to make their money from selling coal boilers. They haven't actually sold coal boilers in the UK for some time now. But when I first joined them from the European Commission, a lot of them sort of said to me, well, you can't really talk about climate change, that's killing our business. And I thought, too late. But it's taken them a long time to get to the position of thinking, okay, where is the world going? How do we map that for ourselves? And this would have been enormously helpful to them. How do we map that for ourselves? How do we tell which direction it's going in and the speed of travel? And what are the products and services that we're going to sell into that new world? And I've seen the same process happen actually with the European Power Plant Suppliers Association a year ago. If you talk to them about climate change, they'd come, no, keep that away from us. This year, following the divestment campaign, and the Secretariat had said, do you want us to go back on that? And no, coal is pretty much dead now, isn't it? We need to move on. So I think industry in Europe has got to a very interesting stage where they're thinking about even the most recalcitrant parts of that industry, perhaps except for the steel industry, given what's happened in the UK in the last few weeks, but looking at, okay, what is it that the world is going to look like? What does that mean for our company? Does that mean that we need to invest in innovation? Does it mean that we need to invest in changing our business models? Does it mean that we need to make acquisitions for somebody who's already done some of that innovation? And how is it that we're going to operate in that new world? One of the things that also impacts on that, of course, is policy and policy statements. And over this course of perhaps since May of this year, there have been a number of policy statements in the UK that have probably been designed by Treasury to apparently help business. In fact, if you're on the business side of this, policy statements that move away from where you thought you were going are incredibly unhelpful, even if there might be a short-term gain. If somebody told anybody, any company now, to build a new coal-fired power station in the UK, they just wouldn't do it. If they said, go ahead, you're free to do that, nobody would do that. And therefore, actually, once you know the direction of travel that you're going in, you know you're moving towards a decarbonised world, actually putting the brakes on doesn't help, really. What you need is a sense of the speed of travel and then the policies that will support that along the way. And that means that when you have policies such as the European Emissions Trading System, which has had some unfortunate experiences along the way, some of those are a symptom of success. They're not all about the downturn. Some of them are about the way that companies have responded to that policy and have changed the way they've done things and have reduced the amount of allowances they might need. So one of the other hats I wear is I also do some work for Cambridge University's Institute of Sustainability Leadership. And I did, to promote my own work, a report earlier this year where I talked to some of the companies who'd been most successful at cutting their emissions that were covered by the EU ETS to find out what it was that really happened. And obviously for the energy intensives, the carbon price is very important, but some of the most astonishing stories were those who were the less energy intensive, where when the price had hit, and it's difficult to remember now that the price of EU allowances was about 20 euros a tonne for a couple of years, that at that point a number of CEOs decided to do what it's taken Doosan Babcock and others till now to do, and say, okay, the world is going to be low carbon, what do we do about it? And start to put in place the processes, carbon teams, changing the investment framework that will help them do that, where the carbon price has actually supported everything they've done by giving them that benefit. They don't need to buy allowances, their competitors do. They actually might be able to sell allowances when they didn't think they would need to. So policies are incredibly important, but that direction of travel is probably the most important thing, which is underpinned by what is happening, the bigger macro picture of what is happening around the world. What is China doing? What is the US doing? The impact of the shale gas revolution in the US and how that is influencing policy in Europe, how it's also influencing policy more broadly across the world. One of the things that I think is most exciting about the Paris COP has actually been this move from top down to bottom up to INDCs. One of the reasons that's so exciting is because it's having the same impact that the more enlightened companies have had on themselves, where you look inwards and say, what is it that we are going to do? That requires information, it requires you to think about what you're going to do. And again, the global energy will help in that process of countries looking at where is it we are now, where do we want to be, what are those scenarios, and how do we get there? So I think we are really at a turning point. Yes, finance is incredibly important, but lots of things change along the way. It's interesting to remember that despite the rhetoric, and UK has been renowned for being a leader on climate change, and Poland hasn't, in 2005 they both had 2% of energy from renewable sources or electricity generation from renewable sources, and today they have about 15% each. They've both changed in the same way, but actually if you listen to the UK government or you listen to the Polish government, you wouldn't necessarily suspect that. Similarly, one of the main debates within the COP over the years has been technology transfer. Doosan Babcock, Doosan is a Korean company. They wanted the technology, they bought it. They bought the company that owned the IPR. At the moment, we have the Chinese president visiting the UK, and I'm not sure if it's happened today, but certainly I know that the UK government are incredibly hopeful that the Chinese technology will be coming to the UK. This has changed over the last 15, 20, 30 years incredibly. So we go into the COP knowing that I think, as Jim said, that the global energy, the tectonic plates of global energy would have changed anyway, even without climate change. But we go into the COP with a new paradigm where we've got all countries looking at what they are going to do, which we've never had before. We have a wealth of experience, some of it very, very hard-won experience, and we have a real prospect of achieving something which countries and companies can build on to actually turn around their carbon footprint in a way that I think will be far better than any of us had expected. And I think I've already had my 1-minute warning, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
I'd first of all like to start by thanking our speakers and our discussants for an amazing whistle-stop tour of some of the issues that are begged and will need to be addressed at the Paris COP. As chair, and the next 20 to 25 minutes will consist of a question and answer session, basically with the panel, questions from the audience. But as chair, I claim the privilege of asking the first question, and I will put it to Jean-Charles, since he is immediately to my left. Jean-Charles, what do you expect to be the defining theme of the Paris COP?
Well, that's all right. I try to summarize in this way. Madam talked about the INDCs. My vision of what happens is that we have the INDCs. That's a good progress. But if you look at that in the eyes through the lens of the people in developing countries, I had a phone conversation with India. Well, we have made an effort to make explicit what we can put on the table. But what we are gaining from that? Why not? And my way of presenting finance is there. I mean, well, they want something. They don't really believe. They will say they will ask for it. They don't really believe that there will be a lot of money. There will be money. That's important on the Green Climate Fund, and we have to do the job. But this is not. They are realistic. And this is why I come back to finance and to say that we have to demonstrate our capacity in the next steps to negotiate the capacity of really deriving a lot of the savings all over the world through the low carbon investments. And this what happens they created their own World Bank, their own banks, and they are now looking at what we can do to improve the financial intermediation systems to redirect. They will not be signed and ratified in COP21, but if simply we stand in the posture of saying, well, oh guys, we have the INDCs, that's okay, we'll convene the business to come and so on and so forth, they will not believe us. So I think that what is happening now, and today, in these days, that we have the Brazilians who have signed an AFO for the sub-Saharan Africa, who said to the North, but we want to be serious about that. They know that there will not be a real deal there. But what I stand, we define something for the near future will be really important. So the link between the INDCs and the way to have some gains of cooperation on the INDCs.
So global cooperation.
Global cooperation.
Global cooperation.
And they say that. They say that. They don't want to share the pie. The diplomatic word of Cancun was totally not enough for one. Equitable access to development. That's political rhetoric. It changes from the sharing the pie point.
Would any of my fellow discussants like to pick this one up?
The floor. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the floor. So can I have questions from the floor, please? Neil, if we could take the microphone to the back, please. Thank you. And some more hands while we're... Okay.
I'm Neil Strachan from UCL. I particularly enjoyed all the presentations, but particularly the modelling slides. I thought they were interesting. My question to the panel is, when do you think the 2-degree window will close, or is it shut already?
Who wants to take this one first?
Well, I don't mind starting. Well, we keep worrying that the 2-degree window has shut. I think one of the most encouraging things I heard was that the pledges, the INDCs, added up to 2.7 degrees, which was way closer to 2 degrees than I ever expected from that. And I think the other thing that we have learnt over the years is that actually reducing emissions increases efficiency. So, for example, there is an Italian cement or an Italian-owned cement company, Italcementi, who now use CO2 as their metric of efficiency globally because it brings in all the major things. So I think what's happening now is that instead of emissions reductions being seen as a cost, they are increasingly seen by companies who start to really focus on that as a way of actually improving their efficiency. And I think those two things together, particularly alongside the INDCs, will mean that we probably do get there or get close to it over the next decade.
Paul, do you want to...
Yeah, I don't think the 2-degree window will ever close because it is a political target and it is incredibly important as a sign-up from 194 countries to a level of ambition, a large level of ambition. As we know, the 2-degree window is probabilistically defined anyway. Our model is not quite as optimistic about 2.7 degrees on the INDCs as the climate tracker one, which I think is the one you're referring to, Jill. But I think anyway, the fact that the world's governments have signed up to that target is enormously important. I'll never forget Jeffrey Sachs when he came and gave a seminar here and he was asked a similar question. He said that has to be the gold standard because that is what the nations have signed up to and that is what is going to keep them ramping up their INDCs or ramping down their emissions in the political process on which we are now engaged. And so I think it's absolutely crucial that we never try to close that window because that window is doing an awful lot of work politically in terms of getting countries to become more ambitious.
Does anyone want to? Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that rather than the 2 degrees, I would like to think in terms of how far we have actually got from the 4 or 5 degrees we might otherwise have been chasing. So it's a glass half full and glass half empty. I think we've made an enormous amount of progress, but we may or may not get to 2 degrees, but I'm more satisfied with what we've achieved.
Jim? Okay. Right. Nick, I seem to remember that you had your hand up, and I seem to remember that you had your hand up. No. Okay. Nick?
This question about flexibility and...
You've got the mic.
It's a question about flexibility and stability and consistency. The consistency of target that Paul talked about. One of Jim Watson's slides, which was a McKinsey marginal abatement cost curve, just showed how much things have changed. The relative costs of the technology on that curve are now, well, frankly, wrong. And actually, if you look at the IPCC data published in 2014, the relative costs of nuclear, solar and wind are also wrong. That implies that we need a great amount of flexibility going forward in choices that are made by policymakers and by industry, but with a consistency of goal. How do we square that apparent circle?
Okay. Jim?
Yes, so I was using the slide to illustrate the points I made, not don't take the data literally, because it is wrong, yes. I mean, it was probably wrong in 2010, but it's more wrong now. And in both directions, as you indicated. So solar costs are much lower than anybody expected, and nuclear costs have refused to fall, as Paul said. In fact, they've risen. I think I'd use the UK policy, as Jill referred to, as an illustrative example here, because on one hand, we don't know how those technology costs are going to change, and I'll just talk about the power sector rather than the whole thing. But, I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm rather wary when people start asking for us to plan exactly which power stations we're going to build over the next 20 years using precisely which technologies. I think we do need a policy framework that has flexibility in it so that you allow for both upward and downward trajectories in costs you didn't expect. So auctions, the role of markets and competition is really, really important. And obviously if you go to different countries, they will have different views on this. But certainly for our context, I'm very much in favour of, yes, showing the direction of travel, give a certainty on the goal, which is decarbonise the power sector, but where you can use markets and competition to actually reveal which technologies are going to deliver what you want.
Oh, brief, I think that's... I think we need to reply to that. We don't know. But what matters is the credibility and the confidence. Give me the sense that 2 following years you will create a credible system. Might be with a chance of doing a lot of things. It's a very unpleasant metaphor, but, well, after all. During the Second World War, in late 1939, France is defeated in May and June. We nominated a guy who was very good in organizing the story. Okay? In May 40, France was constructing more tanks and airplanes and better quality than the Germans. Why that? Because of the credibility of the guy and because of the common view that we have to. This is a very disagreeable metaphor. But I think you cannot predict if the world really now starts to do something. In a developing country, they are in the bifurcation points. They can either go in carbon-intensive infrastructures or no carbon-intensive ones. So this question of timing depends upon the way you create a credibility. And this is why I think that the 2 degree is useful. The problem is how to sell that. A pure utopia, and that's bad, or something which is our real target.
Does anybody want to...
So I'll speak with my Doosan hat on, actually, as business. What you need, I mean, I've sat on both sides of the table. I've been a government official negotiating with industry, and I've been on the other side asking government for what we want. But what you really need is that strength and certainty of the target and an understanding that government is committed to that target. And actually straying from that, even if you've got policies in place, if you have an unfortunate comment by a government minister that appears to be moving away from that, that's really unhelpful. It's really unhelpful for investing, and what happens then is you get no investment. So I think there does need to be a recognition that this is all quite difficult stuff. We're putting in place policies that are quite new, we get it wrong, they need fixing, but you need to know that the target is fixed and that the government is committed to it, and that the policies will be fixed if they seem to be going off course. That's what you need as business.
Thank you very much. Can I take a question from the front here? And if we can bring the microphone along. And if you can tell us who you are, please. And I'm going to ask all of our questioners to do this as well.
Hi, yes. My name's Hannah Bronwyn. I'm part of the project finance team at Linklaters of the energy sector. Maybe this question is best directed at Paul, but I'm happy for anyone to take it. I was just wondering if you have any comments on why governments around the world, but also in the UK, tend to focus on subsidies to promote renewable generation, whether it's directly from the public funds or socialised in the way of contract for difference, which inevitably then gives rise to this question of how much renewables are costing, rather than relying on putting a proper carbon tax in which fully internalises the negative externality of carbon dioxide emissions, and then just let the market get on with it, and that's actually revenue generating.
Bliss. I might have planted that question, but I can assure you that I didn't. Having said that, the answer is I don't know. In the sense that carbon taxation is so obviously the right way to tackle this particular problem. With intelligent use of the revenues, and when most people talk about environmental taxes, they forget that they raise revenues. They don't just raise prices of carbon, they raise revenues which government can then use in a variety of different ways. And of course, if we were to do that and we were to remove environmentally harmful subsidies on oil, which globally to the tune of something like 500 billion, we would not only reduce carbon emissions by 10% and get economic benefit, but governments would be in a much stronger fiscal position. They would be able to use some of the non-subsidies expenditure and some of the revenues in order to compensate low-income households. They would be able, until we get a global carbon tax, which is what we have to be aiming for, they would be able to put in place special arrangements for the competitiveness of their industries. And even the driest neoclassical economist in the United States would agree with those statements. So it is a mystery to me why we fail to take the obvious high road and use the revenues in a way that is distributionally fair and sorts out competitiveness issues through the transition, and instead we engage in these incredibly complicated schemes of renewable subsidy, which actually doesn't help the industry as much as it might be helped, because the subsidies go wrong, the subsidies are too high or they're too low, the industry fails to take off, or the industry has a huge boom and a surge in the way that we've seen in the UK recently, so the subsidies are summarily cut, and people who thought that they had nice secure jobs into the decarbonisation sunset suddenly find themselves on the scrap heap. It is a really extraordinary policy failure. But unfortunately, as someone who's talked to the Treasury a lot about carbon taxes, who's tried to proselytise in the European level for a carbon tax at the European level, which of course is anathema to the UK government, because carbon taxes, any kind of taxation, cannot be European. That's a kind of ideological sticking point. Well, we have to continue to fight the good fight, but that would certainly be a way in which we would move at least cost towards the decarbonisation goals which governments say they want.
Thank you very much, Paul. Jean-Charles.
I have the explanation.
Go for it. Go for it, yes.
No, because I believe a lot now, given my age in the mental map. I can tell you that's true. When you were talking about carbon taxes, environmental taxes in the late 70s in France, in the country, you met people at the Treasury. They are good people. They are very selected. nice people. They were saying, no, the fiscal system are neutral. They don't interfere with the choice of the people. They are simply here to raise money, and that's it. They have no influence of how the people make the economic choices. Well, little exceptions, okay, fine, the smoke. But doesn't exist. And now we have used this evolved. But this explains why we had so many problems to discuss in the same room, rising taxes for energy and the recycling of the taxes. The past two events in France over the past 7 years, you have the Ministry of Finance there and the guy working on taxation and never discussion, okay? And the Ministry of Finance will say, well, I wait for the guy to make the vote and announce a carbon tax without talking about the recycling twice. There's a real problem in the mindset. And now we have the same problem with the people from the Finance Ministry who support the elite as well. The monetary systems and the financial policies are neutral for the microeconomic behaviors, which are obviously false. But they are rooted in this mental map, and what is dangerous is they are very good and strong. So hard to convince.
Can I something, and perhaps disagree a bit with my colleague on the right-hand side of the table. I mean, it's quite. I mean, there is a land far away where markets are perfect and policymakers behave perfectly and send consistent signals. It's not a land that I think any of us will ever really see. And if you, I don't know, maybe Joe can comment on this, but if you move to the business side of it, you're looking for policies that you know will stick and you know that you will get a return on. And at the top of that list, if that's your criterion, it would be something like a power purchase agreement or a feed-in tariff, which you can take to a lawyer when it all goes wrong and enforce it in a court. Then I'd put the next one, probably cap and trade, because it's certainly volatile, but it's volatile in a way that companies understand. You have volatile markets for all commodities. And the one you least trust is a piece of taxation. Just take the example of the carbon price floor in the UK and the reliance that people put on it before it was summarily removed. So I think, I think Paul and I need to fight this one out over a glass of wine afterwards, I think, because where you're sitting, I think, affects how you see these measures.
Jill, would you like to have a crack at this?
I would like to. I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago who was talking about the carbon reduction commitment, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of, but I think is basically it's a carbon tax at about £16 a tonne for companies that are large energy users that aren't in the EU ETS. And he said to me that his organisation paid absolutely no attention to it whatsoever. It had no board level significance at all. But when they'd had to comply with it initially, they had actually gone through an awful lot of trouble. They'd had to find all of their gas and electricity contracts and bundle them together. They found ways. They saved a lot of money. They cut a lot of waste when they were implementing it. But after that, it had no merit at all for the organisation in terms of reducing their fuel use. And I think it's just psychological. I think if you give people money for doing something, they're more likely to do it than if you tax them for not doing it, unfortunately. It may not be rational, it may not be logical, but organisations are not rational or logical. They're comprised of human beings. We all know how fallible we are.
And just to say, I can see from Jean-Charles' face that he thinks French have perfect policy makers, but we do not.
We were, but we were.
Jim?
Yeah, so collegial as I am, I'm also going to disagree with Paul, actually. So there'll be an interesting fight later. I mean, not on the principle, because I think carbon taxation is absolutely right, economic principles, but politically difficult for all the reasons Jim Ski outlined. But I also want to make the link to the topic I was talking about, which is innovation. A carbon tax, flat carbon tax, is necessary but not sufficient to give you the innovation we need as well, because it will work and it will incentivise whatever's near market at the time, so you need other things. And that's where things like feed-in tariffs have done an incredible amount of work to bring technologies which have been well away from the point where a carbon tax of any conceivable magnitude would help them to the point where it may be that it would. So I definitely think they're necessary, or emissions trading. but it's not sufficient to do the kind of job that we've got on in the timescale we need.
Well, we certainly agree with that. My last slide said that they were part of a package. But if you look at the countries that have managed to implement carbon taxes, and Sweden has a carbon tax of more or less 100 euros a tonne of carbon dioxide, which is a very large carbon tax indeed. They tend to be the ones that are most secure in their decarbonisation pathway because they are giving a signal which both the companies and the households do trust, and the price difference is sufficient for them to make a difference. So, sure, the Swedes are different, they can do it. Other countries have done it to some extent, and I still think that those countries that can do it and can make it stick will find that they get a surer route to decarbonisation, with all sorts of other flanking measures to do with behavioural stuff and do with innovation as well, absolutely. But I think the evidence is there that if you can do it politically, it is very beneficial to do that.
Okay. We had a question in the middle here. So, if you could put your hand up so that they there we go, yes. Could you pass the microphone on, please? Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Name, please, if you would.
David North, UCL. Right. The question relates to the pathway to the 2% target, or what percentage you like, and the McKinsey curve that both Jim put up and one of the audience remarked on as being inaccurate, which I accept is inaccurate. But one of the things that they used it for was to argue that there was some low-hanging fruit which you could put to governments to say, well, look, you can actually go forward at minimal cost, if not with a positive benefit. That argument seems to be potentially even greater now that we have an idea on the co-benefits, particularly some of the other environmental co-benefits. And I'd welcome the responses of the panel to that question.
Who would like to go at this one?
I'm happy to start. I mean, just to say I accept what you say, and especially when you add in the co-benefits, but the problem is when you go to policymakers, at least in my experience, and you say, well, look, there are lots of these negative cost measures, the first response is, why aren't people doing it? And when you have to say, well, actually, there are a number of barriers. I mean, Jill's mentioned the ones at a board level. There are similar research on, households and communities, which show all the complicated reasons we don't pick it up or we ignore it. And trying to make the argument, well, yes, there's financing barriers, you need to pay for the upfront costs, so here's a lot of policy you need to shift people and pick up the whole low-hanging fruit. It starts to seem very economically illogical to people who kind of buy into the very dry economic framework there. So I think there is a bit of a problem with framing it in that way, when there are things that you do need to do, even if eventually, even over 2 or 3 years, lots of people and firms are going to save a lot of money by implementing them. So that's where I think some of the challenges are.
Okay. Jill, would you like to...
I was going to refer back to, I mentioned the report I did for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership earlier this year. And there, the companies that had actually found those low-hanging fruit, and one of them was GSK. And what they had done was they had decided that they were going to put in place a carbon team that would go around looking for carbon reductions. They had a budget. And they were able to change some of the rules. So instead of payback within 2 years, that was extended to 5 years. And they found initially 30 to 40% efficiencies that could be made. And then they go back 2 years later and they find an awful lot of that had been achieved. And there would be another 30 to 40% efficiency that could be made. So they're not, energy is not a large part of their cost, but they said nevertheless, they had to make a conscious effort. They had to put in place a team. They had to give it a budget. They had to give it an objective. But having done that, then they uncovered the low-hanging fruit. But it wasn't, there was an initial cost to it, and they needed that will. And it's the same, we all know it's the same with householders. Who wants to go up in the loft or whatever and sort that out? And it's the same with governments, is how do you uncover those? I kind of think what you need is a sort of INDC for companies and households, where everybody takes stock of what they got and decides where they could save money, because then they will go ahead and do it. And if they were required somehow to take that inward look, then it might uncover it. But pricing alone won't do it, because we're lazy.
Yeah, Paul.
pricing will help, but it won't do it alone. I absolutely agree with that. And I think the most misleading thing about the McKinsey curve is it was actually shown on one of the breakout boxes that Jim showed, which is that there's a perception that because it's negative cost, i.e. you can save money, that it is easy to get people to do it. I mean, the straight economist will say it can't exist because otherwise they would have done it, and there's lots of research now on why that is not the case. But even so, there's a kind of perception, well, it's sort of easy because it's low-hanging fruit and you can just pick it. But actually, it's low-hanging fruit behind quite a lot of policy-style razor wire, where policymakers have somehow to guide the people through to take those actions, which, if they take them, as Jill said, they will save money. But the number of companies that are like GSK and actually do it is far outnumbered by the number of companies that don't, just as the number of households that do it is far outnumbered by the number of households that don't. And it is that impetus, that perception of that ability to design policies that will get through the razor wire to the low-hanging fruit that seems to me to be the policy takeaway from those figures.
I'd like to take two questions over here, if I may. So first of all, the gentleman, could you put your hand up so that there we go, okay. Can you make it fairly quick now because we're in the last few minutes?
Sure, thank you. My name is Dustin Benson. I'm here from Green Alliance. We're a think tank based here in London. And my question is really about bending the curve on emissions. If we're at the point now where we're bending the curve on emissions, I want to think about what the risk of locking ourselves into an unbent curve, if that makes any sense. So I guess my question for the panel is, what is the biggest risk of carbon lock-in that you can see? And you're not allowed to say coal, because we know that one already. Thank you.
So who wants to have first go at this one? What is the biggest risk?
One response for me. It's the bifurcations in the urban dynamics in the developing countries. The most irreversible.
The urbanization issue. Yeah. Yes, I would agree with that.
That's because that's the mobility and one example. Your comparison between Atlanta and Barcelona. Yeah, that's very simple. France was a country with a lot of Barcelona, with dense cities and so on and so forth. And we stopped with that, and this link to the financial systems and what happened after 1995. Okay. Now, what happens is that the French landscape changing a lot. You have a large urban sprawl because you make money simply in buying low-cost land. You build big shops there, and then you earn money. Not because you will sell tomatoes and clothes, but because the land, the price of land increased a lot, and this explains a lot of what happens in France since 2 or 3 decades. So that's what happens in developing countries.
I'll take one more response to that from the panel, if anybody wants to chip in.
Well, I suppose actually to agree with that, but say that there are probably, in Western Europe at least, there are still promising signs of that being reversed. I would say Tesco selling off its stock of land for housing now. But I think that Barcelona versus Atlanta diagram is one of the most compelling that we can have. So I agree, transport, heat, buildings, but urbanisation.
Okay. I'll take one last question from the lady with her hand up.
Thanks very much. I'm Anna Hill, founder of River Cycleway Consortium Limited, which is proposing Thames Deckway. It's a clean energy cycling superstructure for the Thames and other tidal rivers around the world. So my question is what can be done to encourage the role of social innovation and new business models, such as social bonds that encourage interconnection between policy, research and social need.
Thank you.
You punted it over to me. Well, I mentioned social innovation, so I suppose I should answer the question. Again, I'll go at it through an example rather than talking generally, because it's such an amorphous term used in many, many different ways. I mean, one phenomenon we've seen in the UK, which perhaps is close to your interest as well, is the rise of community energy, alongside a number of other types of community activity. And that started to happen partly due to drivers of policy and partly due to a driver in many communities which are rather different of wanting to do their bit on climate change, linked to other broader social capital building initiatives, tackling poverty, social cohesion and so on. It's not only about energy. I think what we can do to encourage is a difficult question in one way, because this action, rather like the INDCs, is bottom up. And I've always puzzled over what a government, say looking to national government, to have a policy on community energy. It's rather a tension there, isn't there? Because you're trying to get a body that operates in a rather top-down way to do something which encourages and fosters bottom-up action. But I think one thing certainly I've come across in the work I've been involved on community energy, which I think we could do, and it comes out in debates about things like the feed-in tariff, is how do you value the broader social benefits of community action versus lots of individual measures. Now, we know from the research, and there's a lot of research out there, mostly qualitative, that there are those benefits out there, social cohesion being one, bringing communities together. There's all sorts of things that you can put your finger on looking at the qualitative research, but that runs straight into more of a quantitative frame of mind from policymakers when they say, well, demonstrate the extra benefit of the feed-in tariff for community energy, and we'll consider it. Yes. And so that's the bridge you've really got to cross, and I haven't seen anybody do that quite yet. Or you've got to persuade the policymakers that actually you need to take a multi-dimensional approach to this and not just think about the immediate monetary return, but think about the social capital you develop as well.
Are there model systems that can take people out of the equation to get to a better solution?
I think people have started to look at that. Maybe Jim wants to come in.
Jim. Just to make a slightly different point. I mean, I think it is a struggle to move in that direction in the UK, given the very centralised nature of decision making and the lack of discretion that many decision makers at the local level have about budgetary allocations and the way things operate. And if you compare us to Germany, that is the big difference, the amount of discretion and autonomy that people employ. So we can exhort people to get into community-based schemes, but it's going to be a very big struggle unless people can actually have the capacity to make their own decisions. And there I would agree with Paul completely that the money matters a great deal, actually, when it comes to making sure that people do get the benefit of the decisions that they make. I think the interesting thing in the UK may be the development of mayors in some of the larger cities with greater powers. And for me, that is something that could be really quite important, because it will move real decision making away from London to closer to where people really live.
Okay. I said that we would finish on time, and I'm going to do my very best now to wind us up. So I would like to sum up the conversation that we've heard this evening by saying that I think the fossil fuel age will eventually prove to have been easier to get into than out of. I personally veer between pessimism and optimism, and I see signs of both accumulating at an ever faster rate. The great philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, defined a paradigm change as a situation where problems accumulate to the extent that the existing paradigm is thrown into crisis. And it seems to me that that may well be what we're going through at the moment. I would like to now turn to more important matters. There are a number of people in the team, in the backup team, that have made this event possible. I would particularly like to single out Ellie Forward, who is standing at the back. And Ellie, would you like to come forward, please? No pun intended. And if I may, I would also like to single out Anna Martinez, who has backed up Ellie manfully over the last few weeks, since both were dropped unceremoniously into this problem by me. So I believe we have something for both of them. Excellent. So if you'd like to bring them down, please. So, I'm afraid I don't have flowers for our panellists, but I think they also deserve them. So consider yourself awarded virtual flowers on behalf of all of us here. And I now declare this meeting closed. I would be grateful if you would exit.